Let me start by saying I came to Orange County in 1985, actually almost exactly 37 years ago. It will be tomorrow, 37 years. I moved into the town of Orange 5 years later in 1990, so I've lived in town for 32 years.
And what brought you here in the first place?
I laugh and tell people I came with Montpelier. I worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and they took over Montpelier actually in November of '84, and I said to my superiors that they were going to need archaeology at Montpelier and that I would be delighted to take care of it. I was the senior archaeologist for the National Trust, and so they sent me down here. I came to Orange County, I fell in love with Orange County, and I've been here ever since.
And does that feeling extend to the town now?
Absolutely, absolutely. I tease people and tell them I live in greater downtown Orange, which always gets a laugh. Mm-hmm. But I live right on Paliso Avenue, so I'm at the western end of town and have enjoyed all 32 years of living there.
What over the past 32 years has stuck out in your mind as far as memories are concerned?
It's really funny. A lot of my memories are food memories. It goes back to the days of coming in from Montpelier and grabbing a sandwich at Sparks, which at that time was mostly a convenience store, but you'd go to the back and you'd order your sandwich. And if you were a good person, you could say, put it on the tab and pay it a few days later or a week later and catch up with it. And I often laugh to think when it was taken over by a more formal restaurant, which was lovely, but it used to drive the manager nuts because people would come in and go to the back counter and try to place their order. No, sit down. Somebody will take care of you. So that was, it was a charming part of Orange. I go back to the days when Leggett was still here. It was the end of their era here, but they were still here. So I've watched Main Street change mostly in a positive way over the years. The vacancies come and go. It still breaks my heart to see Gill Hardware empty. They were still in operation when I first came here, which was a real treat to go into that store. I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, which people think it's very funny when I say I grew up in a small town, country town in New Jersey. They think that's very humorous. But I did. We were 4-H. We thought the FFA boys were real cute. And so it was almost like coming home in the quality of the feel, the small town feel of it. I did my big city stint. I enjoyed that too, but I was ready to settle down.
You're the former president of the Orange County Historical Society.
Yes, I am.
So you obviously have an interest in history. Any tidbits of history that you would like to share or amplify on regarding the town of Orange?
Well, it's a courthouse town, and it grew up serving a very specific purpose, and that was the court days. And those were a tremendous boon at that time, but otherwise people were considerably more self-sufficient, and a town wasn't as important to them as it ultimately became. And then you look around and you say, well, look at all these lawyers. What's a town this size doing with so many lawyers? And then you have to stop. Well, it's a courthouse town. That's why we have all these lawyers. And this is true. You go into any courthouse town and that's the case. And so that, in a way, does not necessarily promote the growth of everyday things. And so it takes a little longer for that to grow in. One of my interests that I've been pursuing, and especially towards the end of my last term of presidency, which ended a couple of years ago, was trying to encourage 20th century history of Orange, because I feel very strongly that we're losing that history. This is going a long way to these interviews to capturing some of that history, but most of it's going to be from the last half of the 20th century. And my concern is very deeply with the first half of the 20th century. We've lost almost all of our inhabitants from that era who remember people like Robert E. Lee, people like Atwell Somerville and Pete Joyner, and I could go on and on. There are so many. Benny Williams from Sparks, that's where I met Benny and continued to know him all until his passing. He had a fascinating history. So many like that. And I think this is very important. We know a lot about the early days of Orange. We know a decent amount about the 19th century, but the first half of the 20th century is kind of lost.
But we do have a photographic record.
Yes, we do.
From then. And we don't have it for the 19th century and 18th century.
This is true, and it's an odd gap. Because photography was around, at least for the back half of the 19th century. And people were taking photographs, but we just haven't captured them. And that would be a lovely thing if people check their attics or check their grandparents and see what's come down.
Right. How does Orange look to you today?
In some ways improved. Certainly Main Street is much more attractive than it was when I first came here, but at the same time it's lost some of the everyday businesses. This is one of my worries, let's say, about Orange, and that is I don't want to see it become an impractical town, is perhaps the best way to put it. It should remain a town that not only can tourists come to and have an enjoyable time, but that the citizen who lives here, either in town or just outside of town, can come into town and find what they want and get what they want. It is more and more difficult to buy local in that sense. One of my biggest concerns at this point is the lack of competition in the grocery store. You know, it's a sad commentary when I choose to drive 18 miles to Culpeper to go to a grocery store when I have one less than a mile from where I live. And it's just lack of competition. I think that needs to be addressed, and that's an immediate future concern. But it's this type of thing that we have to serve all of our community, not just a piece of the community.
I think every single person who has sat in that chair has said something about how there aren't any places like there used to be to retail businesses, and I always ask them, why did they go? And I'll ask you the same question.
Well, there was a time when the charm of the big box lured people away. Why do you go to the big box home store? Because everything you need is there. You don't have to go to 2 or 3 stores. Whereas we did have, even when I moved here, we had at least 3, if not 4 hardware stores. I'd have to sit and count. But we had at least 3 hardware stores that I can name off the top of my head. And all of them were well supplied. And by going to a couple of them you could, but one-stop shopping came in. The same thing with retail, like clothing stores. And a smaller store, there's no question, has a more difficult time competing because they can't order in bulk and therefore, say, offer you 10 screws for a dime as against the smaller store that has to charge you $1 for the same 10 screws. That's going to pull people away. But I think the charm of that is fading a little bit, and people, if the gas prices keep going up, they sure as heck are going to want to shop closer to home. But and Orange population is skewed to the elder side. And there's not much question about that. And I think we know why, because opportunities exist outside of Orange. The younger generation goes out, does their thing, and perhaps often comes back, so that it skews it toward the older side. These are people that don't travel easily. Not everybody, but this often is the case where people can't or don't travel easily, and they really feel the lack of being able to buy things locally.
Right. What about the internet, Amazon, and all the rest of it?
Amazon fills a much needed niche, and I will confess that I resort to Amazon oftentimes because it's far easier. A, I know I won't be able to get it here in Orange, and B, I don't want to pick up and drive to Charlottesville, Culpeper, Fredericksburg. And it's much easier to sit at home and say, that's what I want, click, and it's there in 1 or 2 days.
But sight unseen.
Yes, sight unseen, and there are certain things that I will not buy that way. But, if I need a left-handed widget and there's only 5 left-handed widgets made in the world, I'll take a chance on it. Mm-hmm. So it depends on the item. But then there's odd things like, up until recently, we couldn't keep a bakery in Orange. I'm not sure I understand why that should be so. I don't think Orange is full of home bakers. I mean, there are some, but there's odd little quirks like that. We can't keep other kinds of stores for some reason.
What do you see in the future?
Well, what I hope to see in the future is the continued considered mix where we don't ban things like retail, we don't ban growth, but that growth is handled with consideration. I would like to see the small town, rural nature preserved, and I realize that it's a tough balance between allowing some growth and preserving the rural nature, but it can be done. And it doesn't have to be done at the expense of totally gentrifying the town so that it isn't usable by the average citizen. And so I would like to see us continue in the vein I think that we're going, and that is that we are developing a nice little tourist-based industry with shops, but that we can continue to develop the retail base as well, let's call it the everyday retail base. I just see Orange as continuing to be a lovely place to live, and I hope that's the case.